Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Behind the Book. I'm Michael Alexander. I'm the Campus Arts and Culture Liaison, and I want to welcome you here on behalf of our team and on behalf of the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. She's the head of our office, and so we're very, very proud to be there. I want to thank also our sponsors for these events. We get support from the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium. But before I go much farther, I just want to hit 2 points. One, please turn off your cell phones, or at least put them in the silent mode. And if there's any reason where there's an emergency, note that the exits are in the back, and staff will come out on stage and give you instructions on what to do in case we got to find another way to get out of the building for any reason. The sponsors of many of our events, the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, are about to be getting a letter from us. And so I'm going to encourage you to think about joining the Friends as well, because next fall, there's going to be a very big festival taking place all the way from San Diego to Ventura County. The Getty Foundation is sponsoring Pacific Standard Time. It's called PST Art and Science Collide. And Caltech has got 3 different grants coming our way. One that is coming to JPL for a project that they're doing in collaboration with Glendale, and many of the events will be taking place at the Glendale Brand Museum, but we'll have a few on campus, including a play from the Tacit group here. The Caltech archives are looking at a history of graphic art that has been used to help tell science stories. And the program that I'm involved with is bringing in 4 performing art groups. We've got a modern dance company coming in from Taiwan. And the dance company has a robot that is going to be holding a laser light. And as the laser meanders around this stage, the dancers will be interacting with it. And it should be a really beautiful, beautiful company. We've got another dance company telling the life of Alan Turing. We have a theater piece called Tesla, a radio play for the stage. And we have a choral group called Tonality that is doing a program on climate change. Friends of Beckman not only get a $5 per ticket discount on 4 tickets for each of the 4 programs, but they're also going to get first chance to buy tickets. So that's what our incentive is, to get you to join the Friends of Beckman. You can find out about the Friends by going to events.caltech.edu, and you can find out about how you too could become a member of the Friends of Beckman Auditorium. We have we actually have 2 more Movies That Matter programs coming up. 2 weeks from tomorrow, we're showing the film as part of Earth Week called Chasing Ice. A National Geographic photographer was looking at the shrinking glaciers in Iceland, in Greenland, and in Alaska. And so we're going to be looking at his film, and then we have a researcher from campus and a researcher from JPL both here to field questions and to discuss what we now know. It's been almost 10 years since that film was made, and the news is probably not any better than it was 10 years ago. So we hope you'll come for that film called Chasing Ice. And then on May 14th, we're showing a film called L.A. Real. It's part of our Movies That Matter series, and it's looking at a Latina's look at her own history and heritage in the Los Angeles area. It was a play that was filmed for mass distribution, so that those who couldn't see it in a nice small little theater got a chance to see the play as well. The playwright will be here to be part of a conversation after that. Also want to remind you that this building here is the home for the Coleman Chamber Music Series, and we hope that you can take advantage of that. We are going to have a Q&A at the end of this evening's program. You probably have seen in the rotating slides before I came out a QR code. It'll go back up at the end of the initial discussion. You can take your photo element on your camera, point it at the QR code, and it'll get you right to Slido. And Slido will give you a place where you can just ask your questions, and then we'll be able to feed the questions to our 2 speakers tonight so that they can address the issues that you want them to talk about. David Zierler is the director of the Caltech Heritage Project. He arrived here in July of 2021 after working as an oral historian for the American Institute of Physics and at the U.S. State Department. He is now doing plenty of interviews around campus and pulling all kinds of interesting stories from people. Just a warning for any of you who are on campus, be careful if he interviews you. He interviewed Betsy Mitchell, who runs the Caltech athletic program, and she felt so inspired she went out and wrote a book, and I talked to her this morning, and we're probably going to be presenting her in a Behind the Book. So if you get inspired, if he interviews you and you write a book, we may be talking. Tonight we're going to have a chance to learn more about his book, though, The Invention of Ecocide, Agent Orange, Vietnam, and the Scientists Who Changed the Way We Think About the Environment. As the public increasingly questioned the war in Vietnam, a group of American scientists deeply concerned about the usage of Agent Orange and other herbicides started a movement to ban what they called ecocide. David traced this movement, which started in the 1940s when weed killers were developed for agricultural purposes, but the military started considering them for counterinsurgency efforts. Tonight we'll learn more about how scientists changed the Pentagon's assurances, or challenged the Pentagon's assurances that Agent Orange was safe. And he'll be in conversation tonight with Caltech professor Paul Wennberg. Paul is the Arstadt and Avery Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Environmental Sciences and Engineering. His research group studies atmospheric photochemistry and the terrestrial carbon cycle. Before welcoming the two gentlemen to the stage, I want to alert you that there are flyers like this at the back of the auditorium in a rack. If you did not get one, you can pick one up, and it'll give you information about how you can buy David's book. They're offering a 30% discount on the book, and if you get the books and get them to the Caltech ticket office by the 1st of May, we'll arrange to get the books over to David so he can autograph them for you, and then you'll be able to pick them up again at the ticket office. If you want to give instructions, you can put inside of the book dedicated to this person or that person. So please be mindful and pick up one of these flyers at the back of the aud at the end of the program. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage David Zierler and Paul Wennberg.
Hello, David.
Hi.
It's wonderful to be here and to talk about your book and many other things. And I thought maybe we could start by just talking a little bit about the origins of your work. How did this book come to be?
It starts in the Middle East, actually. For my master's thesis, I looked at Soviet-American relations during the Cold War. And I was very interested in the U.S. support of Israel and the Soviet support of Syria and Egypt during the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. There was a very interesting ultimatum that Saudi Arabia, as the leader of the OPEC countries, gave to the United States during the very difficult middle period of the Yom Kippur War in October of 1973. The Saudis said, if you support Israel with a military airlift, we will ban the export of oil to the United States. And even though this was peripheral to what I was interested in great power politics and the Cold War and traditional diplomatic history, I became very interested as a sideshow to oil as a natural resource, as a component of international relations and international security, which I never really thought much about before. What I did not do during my master's thesis was connect the natural resource to the scientists. That would come later. So as I was thinking about my dissertation topic, I was thinking broadly about the intersection of the environment and natural resources and international security. And I think that very naturally landed me on the topic of herbicidal warfare in Vietnam. That was the idea.
I see, yeah. And so then from there, we go, so you're at Temple, and then to Yale, and then finally at the State Department. I think that's interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about, I mean, I didn't think about a historian at the State Department.
Yeah. The Office of the Historian at the State Department goes back to the Civil War. It goes back to 1862. Abraham Lincoln was very concerned that the South was fomenting a revisionist history of the origins of the United States, the origins of the American Revolution, for the purposes of trying to gain favor with England and France. Yeah. President Lincoln wanted to make sure that there was an official diplomatic history of the United States, and so he formed the Office of the Historian. Since 1862, the Office of the Historian has published the Foreign Relations of the United States series, FRUS, as it's known by its acronym. The mission of FRUS is really a statement of what it means to be a democracy, and that's something that we should actually pay attention to right now. The idea is that documents relating to national security are secret, and they should be secret for the American defense, but after a certain period of time, they should be available for declassification. And so the mandatory declassification review comes up 25 years after the publication of documents. And at that point, the Office of the Historian, where we have high-level security clearances on a need-to-know basis, and we can go into all of the government repositories, CIA, Department of Justice, White House, Department of Defense, and so on, based on a given topic, find the most important topics, the most important documents on that topic, write a running commentary to what's happening in the documents themselves, and submit that for publication, ultimately for publication. The idea being that academic historians wait until the official history is declassified to answer questions of foreign policy import.
So I guess the fact that your book comes out more than 25 years after the events told in there is not unrelated. Not
unrelated at all. Okay. I'm highly reliant on declassified sources that I didn't appreciate happened as a result of the office that I would go to work for.
That's interesting, yeah. And so as part of your research, you actually talk to a lot of scientists.
Yeah.
And that's what you do now.
That's what I do now.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning with oil as a natural resource, it wasn't until I got deep into the research on Agent Orange that I recognized that, first of all, the scientists who were central to the story were still alive, and that I can go and talk to them as historical actors, not just as voices in a document. And here, this really allows me to talk about how full circle my career is now that I'm at Caltech. And subconsciously, it must have planted a seed that Caltech, both in its contributions to the creation of plant physiology as a modern discipline and the immediate connection to the invention of herbicides, all the way to the political advocacy of Matthew Meselson, professor at Harvard for a long time, PhD under Linus Pauling here. And I remember in the second year of my research, I worked up the courage to contact Professor Meselson. I'm all of, I think, 23 at this time.
He's at Harvard.
Famous Harvard professor, probably one of the most well-connected scientists in Washington, D.C., the kind of person who pals around with Henry Kissinger and university presidents and things like this. And I asked him if I could come and talk to him. And he said yes, and I was a nervous mess on my way up to Cambridge. And I spent the better part of a day with him. And, you know, I brought my little recorder, and we talked for a really long time, and I got this feeling as we were doing this that I was kind of good at it, and it was also really important for the history. And so that absolutely planted a seed that this was something that I would come back to at some point.
And this could be your day job.
It could be my day job one day.
And that's what it's become. That's good. Okay, so we want to talk now through, I was thinking we should at least go through a timeline of the story
Right.
That we're going to hear about tonight. And in reading your book, there's this whole pre-Vietnam history of the development of an understanding of how plants grow and the controls on plant growth. And some of this goes back to Darwin.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could tell us a little bit, start there. Let's start by talking about how people came to understand how plant hormones work, and then the discovery of some of the agents that we'll talk about later.
Sure. So yeah, this story scientifically really begins in Charles Darwin's lab. His interest in plants was the last major research project of his life. And this is classic 19th century observational science. Mm-hmm. The story goes as he narrates it. He's looking at a plant in his office one day, and he notices that it's growing toward the sunlight, and he wants to know why. Just a very basic and fundamental question. And he did a series of experiments of pruning the plants and cutting them back and placing objects so it would create a shadow, and watching how the plant would work its way around the object to go back to the sun. And from this, he theorized that a plant must have what we now call a hormone system. And it was this theoretical proposition that was the starting point for what would become the modern incarnation of plant physiology. Right. And so by the time you get to the 1920s and the 1930s, owing to the leading research of Ken Tiemann and F.W. Wendt here at Caltech, they identified the structure of the hormone system of plants. They focused on auxin in particular, and from there, industry got involved, because very quickly, what we now call translational research, a fundamental discovery, can now be translated to societal benefit. And the two main areas, and now this gets us into World War II, the two main areas for which phenoxy herbicides, so phenoxy herbicides control how a plant's hormone system works. Right. Now, the idea of killing plants, this goes back to Roman times and salting the earth, but poisons are not nearly as useful as herbicides for the following reasons. On the agricultural side, the immediate appreciation is, so since time immemorial, since the creation of agriculture, there have been two ways of ridding a area of cropland from weeds. One is manual weeding, and a weed is simply, there's no official designation for what a weed is. A weed is any plant that you don't want. Exactly.
Exactly.
And so the only way to do that is manually to remove those weeds, or to emblazon the earth or poison it, and those are obviously very counterproductive for agricultural reasons. With phenoxy herbicides, you could create particular chemical compounds that select for the plants that you want to kill, and what they do is they speed up the plant's growth system so that basically they grow out of control and they die very quickly. Defoliation, the leaves fall off and then the plant dies. Yeah. So you can select for the weeds that you don't want while keeping the crops that you do. Yeah. And now, by the 1920s and the 1930s, we have the Wright brothers, we have aviation, we have crop dusters now. Right. So all of a sudden, now agricultural yields, so goes the hope, can now be extraordinarily larger than they once were, much more productive. The other, of course, is war. Yep. And that gets us to the World War II era and the idea that herbicides could be used as a weapon of war, particularly against the Japanese. Yeah.
So the Oppenheimer of this story is Krauss.
That's right.
At Chicago.
That's right. That's right.
And I think we're all cognizant of the fact that with World War II, there was all hands on deck, right? So academic scientists and basically everyone got into the war effort to defeat the Nazis, to defeat Imperial Japan. And we know, of course, the famous story of the physicists and the with Manhattan Project. But this was one I hadn't appreciated, was that chemical agents were also one of the things that people started to understand and think about how they could be used as warfare. And so Krauss is the one who really sort of starts working on this as a warfare agent.
He takes a leave of absence from the University of Chicago to work for the Chemical Warfare Service for the U.S. Department of the Army. And he realizes that in total war, the all hands on deck, as you called it, every kind of technological solution will be put to the effort of defeating the Japanese. World War II, the Pacific War, is a war of beating the Japanese back from one Pacific island to the next, all the way to get to the homeland. And the idea was that if you could defoliate the islands, it would eliminate the hiding spots that the Japanese defenders would have to repel the Marines. And as Krauss explains, if not for the successful ending of the war with the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, chemical warfare, herbicidal warfare would have been unleashed against the Japanese right thereafter. Yeah.
And we'll come back to this, but it was not seen as chemical warfare, right? It was seen as basically herbicidal warfare. We're going to make this distinction because it turns out to be important, and we'll come back to that story.
That's right.
Towards the end.
That's right. And we could talk very briefly about the idea of normative behavior in international law. Warfare, chemical warfare, was a huge part, obviously, of World War I. No combatants used gas warfare during World War II because no one wanted to be the first, and there was a Geneva Protocol to prevent that. But as you mentioned, the conceptualization of the Geneva Protocol was focused on anti-human weapons, not anti-plant weapons.
And thus the title of your book. So we'll get there in a minute, but let's move forward now. This idea of using herbicides in warfare gets put on the shelf, and it comes around again during Kennedy, the Kennedy administration. So tell us about that story, because it's an interesting part of the build-up to the catastrophe that would follow.
Yeah. So the big story here is understanding how the Cold War evolved in the transition point from President Eisenhower to President Kennedy. So in order to appreciate what Kennedy wanted to introduce and his obsession, his affection for high technology, the gizmos and the gadgets that he would use to prevent further Soviet expansionism, based on the idea that the communist revolution had at its origin point Moscow and all of the indigenous communist revolutions that were happening as a result of the decolonization movement. This is after World War II, when the European colonial powers are unable to maintain their traditional colonial holdings. There are now all of these revolutions, these independence movements that are happening throughout the developing world, and that often makes it a battle between what the Kennedy administration, what the Eisenhower administration saw as communism versus capitalism, totalitarianism versus democracy. Now, for Eisenhower, and in the earlier years of the Cold War, Eisenhower was a bit of a cheapskate, and he relied on massive nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, the MAD doctrine, because the United States enjoyed a strategic superiority against the Soviets with regard to nuclear weapons. And as far as he was concerned, the big problem was deterring the Soviets from a takeover in Europe. Now, by the time you get to the Kennedy administration, when these indigenous communist revolutions are now erupting throughout the world, the major critique of the Kennedy administration to what Eisenhower called the new look, which is massive nuclear deterrence, rested on a strategic criticism that was proffered by General Maxwell Taylor. And what he said was, how credible is nuclear deterrence when we're not talking about Berlin, but we're talking about Guatemala, or we're talking about Laos? Is the United States really and truly going to threaten general nuclear war to prevent a communist takeover in one of these small countries? And so the response to this was not that the United States was giving up on its post-war mission to contain communism, to make sure that the next domino doesn't fall. It's that we need to come up with new weapons that take the nuclear brinksmanship out of the equation. Yeah. And this is only bolstered by the fact that Kennedy and Khrushchev brought the world to near nuclear annihilation with the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Yeah. And so when the threat of the North Vietnam Army in its alliance with the NLF, the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam, the indigenous guerrilla operation that was also threatening the government of South Vietnam, when that seemed to be of grave concern and that the South Vietnamese Republic would fall, this is when Kennedy first began the American commitment to saving what they considered South Vietnam. The basic idea is that after the French withdrawal, after their strategic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, we have the Geneva Accords that divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel between North and South, and it is the policy of the North Vietnamese, the communist government in its alliance with the Soviet Union and China, to reunify all of Vietnam and to reunify it on the basis that it's one Vietnamese people, it's one nation. And it is Kennedy's mission not to let that happen and to begin the process of saving the Republic of South Vietnam.
But he saw this not as like, we're going to go in with our soldiers, right? We're just going to go and train them a little better and give them some new weapons.
The doctrine that the Kennedy administration embraced was called, what we now call, it really begins in the Vietnam era, counterinsurgency.
Right.
Counterinsurgency is the idea that there are these guerrilla fighters in the South, and that we need a range of high technology weapons that will preclude the need for boots on the ground, as we call. We will have an advisory American military presence, but not a combat presence. We will give the South Vietnamese army, the government, these weapons in our hope that this will be enough to stave off the takeover in Saigon.
And these weapons included herbicides.
That's right.
And there was no attempt to hide this, right? This was the fact that the U.S. was going to provide these weapons nominally to the government of South Vietnam.
The Kennedy administration was highly attuned to the value of propaganda. That goes both ways. And they were highly concerned that the use of herbicides in Vietnam could be perceived as gas warfare, could be perceived as anti-humane, could be perceived, especially in a war in which there are no fixed boundaries, right? This is not a war of a nation state versus a nation state, where we know the clear delineations between France and Germany, for example. When we're talking about a peasant guerrilla insurgency, there are no fixed battle lines, and therefore there's no easy way to prevent where these herbicides are going to be used. Yeah. So the Kennedy administration is very, very concerned about this. However, they make a strategic calculation. They assume or assert that herbicides are not covered under the Geneva Protocol of 1925. And if the herbicides are used in a very careful and controlled manner, which the Kennedy administration took great pains to do, it would mitigate the propaganda that they knew was coming anyway. So they put the United States on a course of herbicidal warfare, although on a very limited basis, in keeping with the overall attempt not to Americanize the war.
Right. And then we know what happens next, right? Kennedy gets assassinated. and Johnson goes full in.
This is one of the great counterfactuals in American diplomatic history. So when you ask a cosmologist about the multiverse, or you ask a neuroscientist about consciousness, these are those areas beyond data and beyond deductive logic. For historians, that's counterfactual.
Right.
It's the what if. We don't have the data, but it's still fun to talk about.
Yeah.
And so the great what if, as it relates to the Kennedy assassination and how the Vietnam War became the enormous, calamitous 500,000 servicemen, 2 million Vietnamese deaths, 60,000 American deaths. How did that happen? Immediately, one has to wonder, well, when we assign agency, when we assign responsibility for this, it's worth pondering, even if we could never know, is this more about what was happening in Vietnam and it really doesn't matter who was president because this ineluctably is how history must have progressed?
Yeah.
Or is it all about the personalities, and is it all about the fact that we have a new occupant in the White House, he was the vice president, he took the U.S. strategy in a different direction?
Yeah.
We can never know these things, but what we can know is that under Lyndon Johnson, the war became a massive American land invasion. And with that, we see the rise of not a limited spray program, but what ultimately would become, by 1969, by a long shot, the largest and most obviously ecological damaging case of chemical warfare in human history, which it remains to this day.
Yeah, it is remarkable just how much of these chemicals they poured into the country.
Yeah.
And on the production side, so this now, I don't think of the U.S. chemical industry as typically being involved that much in the war industry, but in this case, this was like way more product than they were selling anywhere else in the world, including the United States.
That's right. And the chemical industry in the United States was primed for this because, and now we should go back, after World War II, when these herbicides were not used against Japan, these become fundamental to what we now call the Green Revolution. There was a lot of concern after World War II, what we call a neo-Malthusian concern. Malthus, you know, the idea is with 2.5 billion people, that was the population of planet Earth, the human population of planet Earth in 1945, there was a lot of concern that if you look at the numbers, you look at the exponential growth of the human population, how are we going to feed everybody? And so there's a revolution in biochemistry and genetics that allows for better and hardier crops, and there's a revolution in insecticides, pesticides, and nitrogen-based fertilizers that basically explains to this day how we continue to be able to feed ourselves. And herbicides are central to that, and it's only until the Vietnam War again where we see the chemical industry, who has been happily supplying the world agricultural sector from 1945 right through the Vietnam era, now ramp up production in order to meet the demands of the Department of Defense.
Right. So the major chemicals in the two main chemicals, these chlorinated phenoxy substituted compounds that are used in Agent Orange. If I went to if I'm a farmer and I want to order some, do I order Agent Orange, or was that simply the stuff that the U.S. military was buying?
You mean if you were a farmer in 1965?
Yeah, okay. And I want to buy some of this stuff to put on my crops. Or
right. That's a great question. So why is it called Agent Orange?
Right.
Let's just get to that.
So why is it called Agent Orange?
So originally it was called the rainbow herbicides because the herbicides were identified in 55-gallon metal drums by a color band around the barrel, and there was Agent White and Agent Yellow and Agent Blue and Agent Purple, Agent Green, there were all of the colors. And each of them were selected for particular areas of defoliation or crop destruction. The most infamous, the one that probably gets the closest to a clear crime against humanity, a straight genocide as opposed to ecocide, was Agent Blue. Agent Blue was an arsenic-based herbicide that was used, it was excellent at killing rice. Rice is the obvious staple crop of Vietnam, and the idea is that if you could deny the guerrillas, the hope was that if you deny the guerrilla insurgents food, you can beat them. The obvious problem is that there are no clear delineations. There's not any easy way of being able to distinguish between combatant and civilian, or between areas of war and areas of civilian peace. So, to answer your question, Agent Orange, which was a 50-50 mixture of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, that is infamous for the reason of dioxin. So, 2,4-D, you can go to Home Depot now, so you could be a farmer right now. You could pick up Roundup. You could pick up chemically available Roundup or other brands that feature 2,4-D, and it's still available today. The reason Agent Orange is now infamous, and the reason you wouldn't have known in 1965 to order it, was because when the Department of Defense was putting in these massive orders for millions and millions and millions of gallons of this stuff, the chemical companies in the United States, Dow and Monsanto and Uniroyal and others, in order to meet those quotas, they would heat 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D to higher temperatures. And for 2,4,5-T, when you heat it to a higher temperature, the poisonous and unwanted and at the original point unknown byproduct known as dioxin was created. Now, to fast forward to the post-Vietnam era and all of the tragic associations between Agent Orange exposure and human illnesses and genetic defects, all center around the exposure to dioxin. And that's what makes Agent Orange, unfortunately, the famous one.
And so we're just dumping a crap ton of this stuff all over the mangroves, the forests in the center of Vietnam. And I think your book says something like 1/8 of the country was completely defoliated.
That's right. That's right.
And we need to enter now here Arthur Galston. So Arthur Galston is the person you credit with the term ecocide. And I think, I'll just read this one little statement he said. And he said, this is in an article in 1970, he said, "It seems to me that the willful and permanent destruction of the environment in which people can live in a manner of their own choosing ought to be considered a crime against humanity and to be designated by the term ecocide." So what I thought was interesting about this is Arthur didn't have much interest in sort of the Rachel Carson, the nature and poisoning nature. He was very much of a humanist in the sense that his vision was focused on the crime is not against the forest, it's against the people who live in the forest.
That's right.
And so maybe you can talk a little bit about Arthur, because he plays such a big role in your...
Arthur Galston is the protagonist of the book. He also began his career at Caltech. And as he explained to me, once I was on a roll with Matthew Messelson, I worked up the courage again to go to Yale and talk with Galston. As he reflected, one of his primary motivations was a guilt complex, because he was one of the founders of modern herbicides. And this was, for the first 20 years of his career, his great pride and joy because of its contributions on a humanitarian level to feeding the world's population. And so once he got wind of the fact that this was being now used in Vietnam, on a very personal, even a visceral level, he was just so offended by this. And sort of as an aside, when we're talking about how people felt generally about the Vietnam War, my focus on academic scientists, they're in academia, they are moderate, They are generally to the left, although what that means in 1965 is a very different thing, obviously, than what it means today. They have concerns about Vietnam, and they want to use their scientific expertise, their scientific authority, to do something about it, to change the course of Vietnam policy writ large, but focused in a microcosm where they have something serious to say.
Some agency, huh?
That's right, some agency. And so Galston, as he was really a member of the international intelligentsia. He would hang out in places like Sweden, and he was friends with Hannah Arendt and people like that. And in the early 1960s, once it came out what the United States, really the mid-1960s, just how destructive American military practices were in Vietnam, there were serious, non-fringe discussions about the relevance of the Nuremberg trials as it relates to what many people were alleging were war crimes in Vietnam, war crimes writ large.
This is the crime against humanity.
This is the crime against humanity. So Galston ran in those circles, and he was interested in those ideas. But as a scientist,
it wasn't that long after Nuremberg.
That's right. And we should, you know, nowadays, World War II seems like so long ago, and Vietnam not that long ago. You can probably remember a little bit of the Vietnam War.
I am that old, yes.
Right. But in 1965, it's only 20 years ago.
Right.
That's like the Iraq War to us today, right? It's really not that long ago. And Galston and his colleagues, Matt Messelson and Arthur Westing and Bert Pfeiffer at the University of Montana, what they decided to do was to channel their general anti-Vietnam War sentiment to this very prescribed issue of herbicidal warfare in Vietnam. And it's an interesting case study of how, and this is something in the historiography, how historians debate with each other. It's a very fundamental question as it relates to the 1960s and Vietnam protest and things like this. And that is the question, for all of the protests throughout the United States, that starts in college campuses, and then when Walter Cronkite famously says we've lost middle America, right? It begs a very simple and obvious question. For all of that protest, did it actually move the needle on government policy? Did the U.S. government, did the Kennedy, the Johnson, the Nixon, and the Ford administrations, did they change what they were going to do as a result of all of this unrest? It's a very complicated question. One of the things that I argue in the book is that as a boutique anti-war movement, these scientists, as far as I can tell, are the only documented case where a group of people who are protesting some aspect of the Vietnam War actually force the end of at least one aspect of Vietnam War policy.
And that is herbicides.
That's herbicides.
Yeah.
That's on the basis that ecocide, and what Galston meant, as the quote you read demonstrates, what ecocide is not a crime against nature. It's not a crime against the trees. And as an aside, ecocide now has taken on a life of its own. You see this term bandied about in you know, as it relates to climate policy, as it relates to what's happening with the you know, environmental degradation, corporate takeover all over the world. But it has a very clear etymological root in the concept of genocide, by which Galston meant genocide does not have to equal Auschwitz. It does not have to equal the mass extermination of people. What it can mean, particularly in an agrarian peasant society, is that if you destroy the environment upon which people depend, right, that is not a crime against nature, it's a crime against humanity. And so that's where you have the merging of ecology and genocide into ecocide.
Let's talk about Messelson, because another fascinating character. And when I was thinking about too that he really was quite a mover and shaker, right? And was able to organize a field effort to the war zone. And tell us a little bit about how he managed to pull this off.
Well, Messelson is a student of Linus Pauling here at Caltech, and he learned a thing or two about how to be a politically engaged scientist. Linus Pauling, in his day, was probably the most famous and most outwardly left-leaning academic scientist in the United States, if not the world. He was extraordinarily skilled in politics and in leveraging his scientific authority. He won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in peace and one in chemistry. And it's very clear that Messelson learned a lot from him. Messelson is famous. The way that he became a household name, at least in scientific circles, is because of the Messelson-Stahl experiments that happened just a few hundred feet from here, where he demonstrated how DNA replicates. This basically is the final confirmation of Watson and Crick's theory of the double helix structure of DNA in 1953, and it is widely understood now as the starting point of modern molecular genetics and biology. From Caltech, he becomes a professor at Harvard, and in the late 50s and the early 1960s, you have Henry Kissinger, you have John Kennedy. Harvard is his local school, and he very quickly becomes part of the Cambridge establishment that is now leading its academic expertise in DC. Messelson becomes one of the leading scientists to the ACDA, the American Arms Control Agency for the Department of State, and he becomes a leading figure in all aspects of Cold War arms control, including chemical and biological weapons. Now, among the scientists that I've already mentioned, Galston, Westing, Pfeiffer, Matthew Messelson is not a plant biologist. He's sort of very far removed from these things, but he's a mover and a shaker.
He's a Harvard guy.
He's a Harvard guy, and he pals around with Henry Kissinger. And if you want to change government policy, it's going to happen a lot faster if you're having lunch with Henry Kissinger in the faculty club than if you're burning buildings at Columbia or Berkeley.
And so he goes, sponsored by the AAAS, with a group of people, and they go basically muck around in Vietnam under the some fire as well, and they document what has happened there and just the massive transformation writ by the delivery of all of these herbicides. And they come back and they make a report, they publish an article in Science, and it seems like it really was almost a turning point in the sense that now this is exposed. This chemical warfare that the U.S. was doing. Is that correct? Is this really when you sort of see the whole public and other people learning about Agent Orange?
We have to remember that there's no social media in 1964. And there is a free press, and there is news coverage out of Vietnam about what's happening, but that news coverage is highly controlled, and it is sort of something that is responsive to what the administration wants. Having said that, there are reports that start to come out as the Agent Orange, as the herbicide program becomes a massive operation in 1964 and 1965. And when that happens, the first thing that the scientist, Bert Pfeiffer from the University of Montana, he was a zoologist, but he became very concerned about atmospheric nuclear testing. Strontium-90, the radioactive effect of atmospheric nuclear testing. And so he was very attuned to being suspicious of government policy, being suspicious of assurances of safety. And the basic premise of his initial resolution to the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is we don't know what's happening in Vietnam. We have no idea, But what we do know is that they're using these herbicides at military-grade concentrations, and they're using them indiscriminately. So by definition, any assurance that the U.S. government has that this is a safe and controlled program on its face doesn't make any sense. And so what he agitates for, and where Galston and then ultimately Messelson comes into play, is we just want to go there and see for ourselves what is happening.
Yeah.
Now, they're predisposed ideologically to be concerned about what's happening, but their agenda is simply, let's see what's going on.
Let's go look.
Let's go look.
And what they see is that the mangrove forests are heavily degraded. Tropical forests, like the ones shown here.
This is the after.
Yeah. So remember the Tet Offensive, 1968, right? So there was a great effort basically to wipe out these trees so you could see through them. And they come back and they report, and this leads to, I think, in some ways, right, it's at the same time that we now transition to Nixon.
Right.
And so what's Nixon's response?
Okay. So they come back, and the broader context here, because what they see is an ecological apocalypse, like the Moonfield battlescapes of World War I. It looks like that. The area, the size, the 1/8 of the country, the size of the state of Massachusetts.
There's some good photos in the book, if you want to just, or horrific photos in the book.
It is otherworldly.
Yeah.
It's appalling. And the question of whether or not it's even useful for the American war effort fits in very nicely with what I call the collapse of the Cold War consensus. The Cold War consensus from 1947 and the announcement of the Iron Curtain all the way to the end of the Vietnam War is that it is America's place, it is the special role of the United States to serve as the world's policeman to stop the spread of communism. And so Vietnam sort of destroys that because it says, what are we doing? What are we saving ourselves and the world from by all of this bloodshed and all of this ecological catastrophe? So the question of criticizing the overall war strategy fits in perfectly with questioning the actual utility of herbicidal warfare.
Yeah.
And at the end of the 1960s, when we get to the Nixon administration, we now have the rise of what we now think of as a global environment. This is environmental protection that's not based on aesthetics. It's not based on protecting the environment because it's beautiful. It's not based on leisure. We're not protecting the environment because it's fun and it's enjoyable to go into. We're protecting the environment because it's
essential for us.
It's essential for human security. Yeah. And nothing hits home harder than the Apollo mission and being able to see the preciousness of this blue marble that's hanging all by itself in this impossible black void, and realizing there is no plan B. And there still is no plan B, right?
Yeah.
So the idea here is that by leveraging the broader environmental movement, the broader concern that human security is now at stake, that the scientists can now confront the Nixon administration. So maybe we can talk about, we could come back to 1925 Geneva Protocol.
Before we go there, though, let's just remember, right, this is a time of enormous upheaval in the United States. And as you point out, the saliency of the environmental issues really come to the front. And we have the founding of the EPA. Yeah. That's Nixon, right?
That's Nixon.
Congress in particular, there were a number of players in Congress who really saw their role in promoting environmentalism. Right. We have Earth Day, the first Earth Day. So while all of this is happening with respect to Vietnam, it's a microcosm of what's happening across the whole United States.
That's exactly right. And it's made perhaps most poignant by the fact that by the early 1970s, the very first concerns of U.S. servicemen coming back home with mysterious and terrible illnesses, what's going on here? There's a general understanding that bad, poisonous things were happening in Vietnam, and now they're bringing it home. So it's even more than just a conceptualization of the environment as a global whole. Right. It's that what's happening all the way across the world comes home in the most real way, the most visceral way possible.
Because it was friendly fire.
That's right. That's right, because they were exposed.
And it was, all of a sudden now, this was seen as friendly fire. This was chemical warfare.
Chemical warfare. That's
this was
right.
not allowed. You told us this is not allowed. The normative thing, we're not going to do chemical warfare. So,
right.
So how does, what's happening
What
here?
happens here? Okay, so this is a classic story, and it fits well with Watergate and the ham-handedness and the ridiculousness of the Watergate break-in. Like, really? This is what you did?
Really? Yeah.
So in 1969, November 25th, 1969, President Nixon resubmits the Geneva Protocol of 1925 to the Senate for its ratification. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then the overall Senate needs to ratify in order for the United States to be legally bound to an international treaty. Now,
and they never did.
They never did.
So the U.S. negotiates this thing.
Right.
Right after World War I.
Right.
And then, yeah, nothing.
This is it's a classic story of how the executive branch and the legislative branch can sometimes work at cross purposes.
Yeah.
So the United States, at the presidential level, is a vigorous supporter and architect of the Geneva Protocol. The basic premise of the Geneva Protocol is never again. That the horrors of chemical warfare, of mustard gas and of chlorine gas, they should be banned for all time. The United States helps bring this to international agreement. It's signed at Versailles, and then the famous isolationist Congress that we all remember, the isolationist 1920s, yep. The experience of the United States after World War I was, you know, we're surrounded by weak neighbors to the north and south. We have oceans to the east and west. We don't want to get involved in those colonial great power wars ever again. We just want to not be a part of it. And so the Senate never ratifies the Geneva Protocol, so it's sort of hanging out there, right? To go back to the Kennedy administration, they assessed the Geneva Protocol, even on the basis that we weren't a signatory to the protocol, yeah. We still wanted to be perceived as obeying and compliant to the normative behavior that it enshrined. Okay, we can go back now to the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration at the end of the 1960s wanted to pursue a policy of détente. Détente is a French word. It means a relaxation of tensions. This really becomes a matter of life and death after the Cuban Missile Crisis because we can never allow that kind of brinksmanship to bring us to the precipice of a global disaster, a civilization-ending disaster. And so there should be a series of measures to relax tensions, to improve communications with the Soviets, and also to reduce our weapon stocks, what we now call weapons of mass destruction. So in conjunction with resubmitting the Geneva Protocol of 1925 to the Senate, Nixon unilaterally renounces our bacteriological warfare program. Right. To this day, we don't have an acknowledged bioweapons program, and wanted to unilaterally or with the advice and consent of the Senate to severely reduce our chemical weapons stockpile and therefore be a leader in chemical and biological arms disarmament. The scientists pounce. They see now a perfect opportunity where this is submitted to the Senate for its consideration. What does the Senate do? What does the Senate Foreign Relations Committee do? They hold hearings. And so the hearings that the Nixon administration assumes are going to be friendly and supportive, and this is wonderful, and we're going to get rid of all of these terrible weapons, all of a sudden becomes the perfect platform for the scientists to say, how can we possibly have a serious discussion about chemical warfare disarmament while we're in the middle of the largest chemical warfare operation in history?
Right.
And so that's the discussion that the scientists begin to have on Capitol Hill with a democratically controlled Congress that doesn't like Nixon and wants to delegitimize his efforts in any way that they can.
And of course, they didn't get to do that because they had to wait for Ford.
They had to wait for Ford.
But they did, in the end, right? The Senate did act on this request to confirm the Geneva Protocol.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things that amplifies this entire process is, and now this gets back to Matt Messelson, in 1966. There was a news leak that Dow was aware of the presence of dioxin.
Yeah.
And this is one of the shameful cover-ups in American history, because even though they knew this, and even though this went to the Pentagon, the idea was, and again, this is a Cold War us versus them mindset in the middle of a war where you're doing what you can to win. If you believe that defoliation is going to save American lives, it's a calculation, it's a strategic calculation that you say, okay, maybe there's this impurity, but it's aimed at the enemy and we're not going to be concerned about it. Once it became known that dioxin was present in Agent Orange in 2,4,5-T, and that it had potential, and now we get into the epidemiological issue of correlation versus causation, but at least in lab mice, it was very clear that exposure to dioxin in massive quantities had clear impacts on both cancer and genetic mutations. Yeah. Once this came out, and Messelson was well positioned, as he tells the story, it is an amazing Caltech story. Lee Dubridge, former president of Caltech, becomes Nixon's science advisor. Messelson did not know Dubridge. They did not really ever cross paths, but this is what we all understand as the magic of the smallness of Caltech. What can you do with such a close-knit campus community? Messelson cold called the White House, explained who he was and what he had done at Caltech, and assumed that the former Caltech president, on the basis of Messelson's Caltech connection, would take the call. And when Messelson got Dubridge on the phone, this was the beginning of the end of herbicidal warfare, buttressed by the fact that the Senate was predisposed to say, all right, even if the legality is not so obvious about what's an anti-plant weapon, what is an anti-personnel weapon, we're not going to sign the Geneva Protocol the way Nixon wants to. As you mentioned, we're going to have to wait until the presidency of Gerald Ford. After Nixon's resignation on on August 8th, 1974, Ford comes in, he succeeds Nixon. He famously says, our great national nightmare is over. And as a result of this, he pardons Nixon, and he wants to clean up a lot of the messes from the Nixon administration, which include signing the Geneva Protocol on the basis that it does include chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange. And now this is where the big significance, as far as I'm concerned, really happens. Renounces as a matter of national policy the first use of herbicides in war ever again. And to translate that, what that means is that the United States promises that it's not going to be the first to use herbicides in war again. And to this day, herbicides have never been used by the United States and have never been used by any other major combatant in war. And that is not an insignificant achievement when we think about where have wars been fought after Vietnam?
Right.
You just follow the rainforests across the global equator. When you follow all of the civil wars and insurgencies in Latin America, in Africa, and in Pacific Asia, these are all places where the same calculation that the United States took in the early 1960s, other combatants could have taken in the 1970s, all the way to the present. And unlike nuclear weapons, which are obviously extraordinarily hard to produce and to deploy, defoliants is Roundup. They're available basically to anyone.
Yeah. It's a great story. It's an important story, and I think it has tells us a lot about how scientists interact with policymakers, and particularly around these questions of warfare. I think at this point, maybe we should turn over and hear what our audience is thinking, and any questions that they might have.
I would like to invite also, I didn't get a chance to explain, like, why did I ask you to,
oh, you didn't, yeah,
to be my interlocutor? So I should share that I had the great privilege to do an oral history with Paul, and I learned about his very environmental childhood in Vermont and him thinking about the environment from an early age, and his career trajectory in atmospheric chemistry and the global carbon cycle. And I came to appreciate that the complicated nexus of the environment and advocacy and scientific expertise is one that you think deeply about. And this was a story that I thought would resonate with you. And so perhaps in considering your questions, there's only one Caltech professor on the stage right now, and Paul has many important and interesting things to say about the atmosphere and climate change and sustainability, and in many ways, the kind of work that you do and the political leeway that you have, whether you choose to take it or not, very much is a continuation of the story that I explore in the 60s and 70s. So maybe we could make it more of a, dialogue.
Yeah, and I have to say, growing up in Vermont, this story that you tell here is one that I think there's certainly this whole aspect of the growing environmental movement and so forth was really what inspired me to become an environmental scientist. And so it does have a lot of reflection there for me. Let's talk a little bit about what we're hearing from some of the audience. Let's see, we have a question about toxicity. So we've talked a little bit about the real challenge of toxicology and epidemiology.
Yeah.
In particular, right, unfortunately, we don't even know how much dioxin, what the impurity of dioxin was for a lot of the chemicals.
Yeah.
Because there's not great records of this.
That's right.
But do we know anything about the children of people who were exposed?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So let me back up a little bit and, just to review the limits of epidemiology. So epidemiology tries to establish causation. We know that there's correlation. We know that there's dioxin exposure, and we know that there are a range of illnesses, from leukemia and diabetes and a range of cancers to the incidence of birth defects. So these things are happening at the same time. And the birth defects we see are happening in children of Vietnam veterans, and they're also happening, and they persist to this day in Vietnam. And the reason they persist to this day, where we are now 3 and even 4 generations, the concern is what we call dioxin hotspots in Vietnam. Dioxin hotspots are areas where the U.S. Air Force stored all of these barrels. And as in so many cases of the war where there's chaos, there's an abandonment of these barrels, the United States leaves Vietnam chaotically, and a lot of these barrels just sort of erode, they rust, they leach into the soil, and now once the dioxin is into the soil, now it's in the food chain.
Yeah.
It's in the groundwater. We now are either consuming the vegetables or the animals that consume these vegetables, and so that now has a persistence ecologically in Vietnam that doesn't exist in the United States. And so the question is, how do we establish causation between the two? We know that dioxin in enormous doses in lab mice creates these problems, but this is a generalized problem in health sciences, right? How do you translate what's happening to a mouse with massive levels to what's happening with Agent Orange exposure in 1968. If you get prostate cancer in 2005 and you served near Da Nang in 1968, is it because of genetics and you're unlucky, or is it because of this? And that is almost because of the complexity of all of the factors. It's very difficult to establish that.
That's right. So another sort of theme coming through on the questions, and it's related, is just the general persistence of damage to the ecosystems of Vietnam. So what do we know if we look today about the forests that were defoliated?
Right. So there's two main stories there. One, in a triple canopy rainforest where the herbicides are administered from the air. So the drops come down, and so what happens there? The top canopy is killed off, and then the next canopy, because there are multiple runs, right? These spray missions happen where the insurgents are fighting. Yeah. And so it's a spray mission, and then another spray mission, and another spray mission. And so by a triple canopy, there's one canopy, there's a second, there's a third canopy. By the time all of that is defoliated, now you have sunlight that's hitting the forest floor. Right. And if anybody's been to a rainforest, has been to a heavily forested area, where there's no sunlight, the forest floor is basically bare because there's really no growth that can occur there.
Right.
When that happens, now you have invasive species. You have imparatta grasses and buffalo grasses and a variety of bamboos. And one of the ironies is that one of the great strategic logics of herbicidal warfare is that it's supposed to clear away all of these areas where the insurgents are hiding. Well, the insurgents are operating on the ground where all soldiers would operate. Now you have these grasses where in some cases, ironically, you have better coverage than you otherwise would have. Yeah. The destruction of the rainforests persists to this day. And in 2008, when I was able to travel to Vietnam, I saw this with my own eyes, the ongoing legacy. The mangroves happily bounce back much better. And there's something about their particular physiology, their close connection to the water. And so in those areas that were regreened due to the efforts of Vietnam ecologists, those basically have been returned to their pre-war state. But the other issue here is that after the war, Vietnam industrialized. And so you have a whole range of environmental issues that are now self-inflicted as opposed to a result of the war itself. So it's a complicated story in terms of the environmental legacy.
So continuing with the toxicology question, there's a question as to, okay, you said you can go out and buy Roundup. Is that a concern? Is there a health concern about using Roundup?
To this day, yes, absolutely there is. But it exists within the framework of the FDA. Yeah. And just because the FDA says something is safe, there does not mean that there aren't concerns about that.
So you don't spray your lawn with Roundup?
Personally not. But it's the same way, it's the same way that if we're motivated to buy organic food, right? When you go to the grocery store and you have a choice between an apple that's organic and an apple that's not organic, if you make that choice to buy the organic apple, what you're saying, and this is as much psychology as it is epidemiology, is that even though if the government said it wasn't safe, then it wouldn't be in the store in the first place, but you're hedging your bets a little and you're saying, okay, I understand that you're saying it's safe, but maybe it's still a little better to buy organic as it is. Yeah. So that's the best way to think about the so-called safety of Roundup to this day. Yeah.
There's a question about napalm.
Yeah.
Napalm versus these defoliants.
Yeah.
What's napalm?
Napalm is a jellied gasoline.
Yeah.
And perhaps made most famous by Apocalypse Now, and I love the smell of napalm in the morning. As opposed to herbicides, napalm was heavily used in the Pacific theater against the Vietnamese. I'm sorry, against the Japanese.
Japanese, yeah.
And it is unquestionably an anti-personnel and barbaric weapon. It burns people alive. Yeah. It sticks to people, and it's not a fast death. It is a slow, agonizing death, and it's also an extraordinarily effective and horrifying weapon. Yeah. It was also used on a massive scale during the Vietnam War, and that's why Dow Chemical came to be seen as the villain of the military-industrial complex in Vietnam because of its dual production of both napalm and Agent Orange. And so if anybody has seen imagery of these massive fire bombings where entire areas are burst into flames. Those are aerial napalm attacks. Yeah.
So maybe we can come close to wrapping this up now, but there's a good question here, which is, what lessons can today's scientists learn from this story about how to effectively influence policy? And I think I can provide my own perspective on that. There's so many famous stories of Caltech and other scientists who, through their research and discoveries and their advocacy that followed that, have really made profound change in this country. And there's a couple of very prominent local examples. Claire Patterson, who was a geochemist here, and Claire was interested in dating the moon. And he went to date the moon, which basically meant measuring some of the rare isotopes of lead, and discovered that he couldn't do this experiment he wanted to do because everywhere he touched, every lab that he surfaced just had way too much lead on it. And he traced that to the combustion of tetraethyl lead, which was a major component of gasoline at the time. And he did this just before the Clean Air Act, and he realized that we were just poisoning all of ourselves and that we were poisoning our children. Beautiful experiments. They went and they dug up very old bodies, and they could show that they didn't have any lead in them, that it was really bioaccumulating in people, and how terrible this would be, given we knew a lot about lead, of course, the toxicity of lead, the Mad Hatter, as it were, and that was mercury, but there were many really good studies that you did not want to eat a lot of lead. And he almost single-handedly was able to get tetraethyl lead included in the Clean Air Act.
Yeah.
And Ari Haagenschmidt, another storied person from Caltech, he was a plant natural products chemist, and the story goes that he had a greenhouse on campus, and for those of you who are around in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of Los Angeles, this was a pretty toxic place to live. The air quality was so terrible. And Ari Haagenschmidt's plants were dying, not from defoliants, but from ozone toxicity. And he went to the chair, apparently, and said, I need a better greenhouse. And the chair said, you should figure out why the air quality is so bad. And so he did that. And then he goes on to found and become the first leader of the California Air Resources Board. And so the theme I've taken away both from your book and from the people I've known is that I think it all begins with having very, a lot of credibility as a scientist. That helps enormously, right? Because it cuts through, in the context of a place where there still remains some trust, we can talk about that, but where there is still some trust, scientists in general are seen as providing information somewhat apart from their own personal views, because that's what makes us scientists, right? Where we need to follow our methods. And I think in all of these examples, and in the ones you talk about in the book, sure, people have some motivations that are not necessarily unrelated to their political or other interests, but they can shepherd their science and convince people that the world could be better. And in this case, through changes in environmental policy, I think we have some great examples.
And when scientists are motivated to become advocates, the examples that you raise, the scientists that I focus on, one of the lessons is that that's effective when you can leverage your scientific expertise.
That's right.
That when you talk about the science that you're an authority on, that's how you're best positioned to make that political change.
I think that's exactly right, yeah. Let's see if we have any other questions here. Okay, it says, I'm being told that the next question is the last one.
Okay.
So let's see. maybe we should finish this up by, maybe you could tell us a little bit about someone you interviewed most recently on campus who might have a different story about this question that we were just talking about, the scientist as advocate, the scientist as scientist. Maybe there's some other people that, because you've been doing a lot of these interviews.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk about Ron Lind.
Yeah, let's talk about Ron Lind.
Ron, one of the all-time great Caltech alumni, one of the all-time great supporters of Caltech, somebody that we've both become very close to in our different capacities. Ron and his wife Maxine built up their company Envirodyne as a result of the EPA and the new regulatory framework that all corporations had to abide by. And in their sharpness and in their focus, they saw a perfect merging between doing good for the environment and corporate responsibility and business acumen. Yeah. And it was an extraordinary success and a point of pride for Caltech and a real lesson for how ethics and hard work and focus and just being really passionate about doing the right thing can be also financially very, very successul. And that's,
you know, we're the benefit of that
and
success.
We are, yes, we are, in more ways than one.
Yeah.
And that's, it's also a story that pushes against the idea that what's good for the environment is not good for the pocketbook.
Right.
And, you know, until the point comes when our environmental rapaciousness is so terrible that we can't make those consumer decisions about what we want to do, it's always going to come back to the market. And what's good for the market needs to be, what's good for the environment needs to be filtered through what's good for the market. And hopefully we'll never get to that point.
With some limits, right?
With some limits.
That's right, yeah.
And the legacy of the Linds, I think, is very instructive on making those right decisions.
I could tell one little anecdote here is that when I came to Caltech in 1998, and I was recruited in part by the chair of the divisions of engineering and geology, by this offer that yeah, we're going to put you in a pretty nasty little building, but there's going to be a new building for the environmental science and engineering program. And I was like, great. You know, it's one of those things that you sign and then you realize there was really nothing behind that suggestion. And so years go by, and it was Ron Lind and Maxine Lind who gave the gift that really created the Lind Center for the Global Environmental Science, where my laboratory is, and lots of other amazing scientists that I get to interact with every day.
And now sustainability is a term that we all use.
That's right.
It came from a certain place, and certain people made it possible.
That's right, yeah. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody.
I want to thank you both. I think this may have been the most important behind the book that we've done to date. We were talking here, hearing you talk about the important responsibility that scientists have in forming public policy, and we've not had a conversation quite like this before, and I can't thank you enough. There were a number of good comments coming here from people from the audience. I do want to acknowledge Jiang was writing that, Jiang is a PhD candidate here and was writing about former Senator, former Secretary of State John Kerry after his Vietnam experience giving testimony, and the last comment here was that the Cold War philosophy is an outdated strategy and is still being used by Washington now. There should be a more open conversation between Beijing and Washington. I think that I didn't want to ignore the comments that were coming from this, but I want to thank you very, very much. Remind you that for those of you who are going to be watching this on broadcast, and because this will be on our website, you can tell your friends also that they can watch this. It'll be probably about a week before it is on the archive list. But for those of you who are watching it and not here tonight and not able to pick up the flyer, it is the University of Georgia Press. You can look up the University of Georgia Press. You can look up the book title, The Invention of Ecocide, and there's a whole slew of different ways that people can purchase the book, and I would encourage people to do so. I want to thank you all, remind you that we've got the Chasing Ice 2 weeks from tomorrow night, and LA Real in May on the 14th. Thank you all, and please help me thank these two gentlemen for such an incredible evening.
Thank you.